Firstly, thank you all for joining. I'm sorry that we started a few minutes late, and we'll do a brief introduction, and then we'll jump right into the actual content of the presentation. Firstly, of course, this is a very relevant topic. It's unfortunate, very unfortunate that it is a topic of this day. It's something that I guess both Tanya and I it's personal for us because we both come from these countries. So again, it is sad, but it's also very relevant. It's relevant not just for the world and for the types of things that are discussed in the news. It's also relevant for our work and for what we do in the KYC sector. So we're excited that we can share our perspective on it and how it impacts our work. Before we do that, I'll do a brief introduction of myself as well as Sqope, the company I work for, just so you know, just so you put a bit of biography to the face. And then I'll pass the mic on to Tanya, who will be leading the majority of the presentation. I'll be here to monitor any questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to write it in the Q&A box, and I'll take them down. If there's something that you need to have answered urgently, just let me know, and I'll make sure to do so. But I'll be communicating on this other computer over here. So if you see me turning my face, I'm still with you. I'm just on another monitor. And so my name is Levi Erdifti. I was born in what is now Russia. At the time was Leningrad, the Soviet Union, now is St. Petersburg. But I left at a young age. I grew up in the US since I was around 3 years old. I moved to Israel, where I'm based now in Tel Aviv, just about 10 years ago, to pursue a master's degree, which eventually led to a career in intelligence for me here in Israel. And that's what I've been doing most of my professional career. I started off in academia and then in geopolitical risk consulting, where I focused mostly on conflicts in the whole EMEA, but especially Middle East and Africa. Also a bit of the CIS and the former Soviet Union. I took a brief stint and worked for the UN, also within the conflict right here in our own country, before joining Sqope about 2 years and 2 years and 1 month ago, just about, where I lead our intelligence division. And I know most of you are familiar with our company, but for those that aren't, I'll give a brief introduction. Of course, if you have any questions at the end, I'll leave my contact details up, so you can always reach out to me directly. I don't want to take too much time about the company. It's more important to speak about the content, but Sqope is a deep due diligence company. We provide various types of reports that focus on KYC, AML, and CFT. We also provide ESG reports, and that's something that we incorporate into all of our reports. We also have one that's very much focused on that, as well as source of wealth reports. Most of our clients are spread throughout Europe in over 20 jurisdictions. We have clients outside of Europe, but the majority of them are in the financial sector in Europe as well as in the UK. And we have over 250 clients that we've been working with in over a decade of experience that we have. In that time, we've also done over 5,000 investigations worldwide, and we've covered subjects from almost every country in the world. Just last year alone, we've done over 100 subjects from over 100 different countries. And just a bit about what we do. Like I said, we're a deep due diligence company. We're not a technological company. We don't provide a software. We do have software solutions that we developed in-house to help us in our research, and we do have some SaaS products that we use. But the crux of our work, the way we're able to do our work, is through our human capital. We have analysts spread throughout the world, really from Latin America, Africa, Middle East, Asia, Europe, of course, and they are subject matter experts. They're all experienced analysts from various sectors, from the intelligence world, in the public sector, in the military, and as well as in the private sector. And amongst us, we have over 20 languages spoken, but majority of our skills come from the development of the methodologies that we have, and our ability to follow different jurisdictions to a very good level. So again, that's a brief about Sqope. And without further ado, I'd like to take the opportunity to present Tanya Zhuchenko, who will be leading the presentation, and give her an opportunity to introduce herself as well as the presentation as well.
Thank you, Lev. It's very nice to meet you all and to see you here. I'm sorry if I will be coughing through the presentation. So I was born in Ukraine right after the fall of Soviet Union. My family immigrated to Israel when I was 10. I have 8 years of experience as a Russian language analyst, both in the military intelligence and private sectors. I have been with Sqope since the summer of 2018. Currently, I'm a senior analyst and a member of the editorial team. Previously, I was the head of the Russian desk, which covers former Soviet Union countries. I never actually counted the exact amount of reports I wrote, but at this point, it's definitely more than 100, probably more than 200 KYC reports on Russian-speaking subjects. So today's presentation will focus on two parts. Firstly, I will give you a brief overview of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and a short timeline of the sanctions since the invasion. And the second part will focus on the current and future challenges for KYC research. Particularly, I will focus on the media situation in Russia, the influence on the conflict, on the ability of financial information in Russia and Ukraine, the challenges of understanding sanction exposure, and we will discuss some open questions which will develop as the invasion develops. So as you probably have seen in the news, the war between Russia and Ukraine have been going almost for a whole month. I want to present you like a very brief overview of the events which led to the invasion, because, you know, if we had to look into the full picture of historical events, we can talk for 2 days in order to properly understand the situation. So firstly, it's impossible to talk about Russia and Ukraine without mentioning the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. After Ukraine declared its independence, the country remained dependent on Moscow and Russia in the following decades. There was several points in time when they tried to take a step back from Russia. For example, the Orange Revolution in 2004, when then president candidate Zhuchenko won against the pro-Russian candidate Yanukovych. However, the post-revolutionary government eventually gave into infights and scandals, and in the end, the pro-Russian candidate Yanukovych won the election in 2010. However, his government also was very corrupt, and he basically failed to deliver on his promise to bring Ukraine closer to the European Union. And you probably heard this name, Maidan Revolution, pro-Western protests of Ukrainian citizens, which resulted in then pro-Russian president fleeing Ukraine. Of course, Russia was not so happy about this development, and it resulted in Russia annexing Crimea and establishment of two pro-Russian separatist regions in Ukraine, Luhansk and Donetsk, or as you have probably have seen in news, the Donbas region. So since then, Russia and Ukraine have been in constant armed conflicts for 8 years. There was some tries to reach ceasefire in Minsk, Belarus in 2015. However, these agreements were very fragile, and during the several last years, the tension was rising again, especially last year. In December last year, United States actually made assessments that Russia is going to invade Ukraine, and they were right. On February 21, Russia recognized the independence of Eastern Ukrainian separatist regions. And on February 24, Russia's President Putin announced the start of a special military operation in Ukraine, or the current war. Of course, it's very, very brief summary of what happened. You can read books and papers which discuss everything and what were Putin's reasons to attack and everything, but sadly we can't go into depth of this issue. And just to show you on the map, you know, Ukraine, Russia, the separatist regions, Crimea, everything is very close. So as a result of this invasion, Russia received the most powerful and costly punishment ever imposed on a major economy, at least in the Cold War. The sanctions' swiftness and extent and the coordinated global support for Ukraine are unparalleled. It's something, basically, it's history, books, events, what is going right now. And just to put it into perspective, Russia is now the single largest target of global sanctions. If we'll compare it to other countries, there are no more sanctions against Russia than against Iran, Venezuela, Myanmar, and Cuba combined. If we even compare it even more, for Iran to reach this amount of sanctions, it took 10 years. Russia received the same amount in like 10 days. And if we want to look into like proper timeline, what happens day by day since the invasion, you can see that since February 24, there were more than 40 separate restriction announcements by different countries. So it's several announcements each day with we'll see like a proper graph soon, but it's completely overwhelming amount in information. If we look this very, very small picture, it's like day by day timeline with, each day several countries announce their sanctions, different countries, very hard to track everything together. And here, basically, it's much easier to look at the situation. In a graph presentation, you see in some days there's more than 500 different sanctions on Russia. So sanctions target Russian politicians and officials, including Putin himself, oligarchs, major corporations, financial and military institutions, and in addition to sanctions, there's sectoral sanctions that have restricted Russian banks' access to international markets. And one of the challenges is being able to comply simultaneously with new sanctions regimes being drafted by several different countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, European Union, and some other nations. And as all the sanctions have the same purpose, but operationally they're different in terms of how fast they are and the manner with which they implemented. And there's a lot of nuances how to what each sanction say, and you have like thousands of different sanctions in 2 weeks. And also, it's very important to mention this war will also change any future war, any future global conflict. It will change how sanctions, how the Western world implements sanctions, and we want to learn from the situation right now, to see what will happen next time, and sadly next time will also happen. As a result of the sanctions and exclusion from global market infrastructure, a lot of Western companies are leaving Russia, both because of the sanctions, and both because of a lot of pressure from shareholders and public opinion, reputational pressure. So basically, right now there's 4 scenarios for Western companies in Russia. The easiest one is completely withdrawing all business. It's mostly relevant for sectors which are asset-light sectors, which they mostly have only workers, lawyers, consultants, people who just can say, well, from next day we stop working, we live in Russia. For sectors which have more assets in the country, more workforce, it's more difficult. So a lot of sectors, they suspending operations. They stop working, they still paying their Russian workers. They keep the door open to maybe return their activity if suddenly there will be a change, if the sanctions will be lifted. And they don't want to just stop everything in one day. They want to return sometimes. And some companies, they describe it as reducing activities. They scaling back some business. They say, well, we will not invest in Russia in the future. We will not advertise in Russia, but they keep basically the basic operations are the same. It's some sectors, like medical sectors, when the companies say, well, we have to keep producing pharmaceutical products. It's a humanitarian need. And also, it's important to mention some Western companies have franchise agreements, which, like McDonald's, even if they decide to exit the country, local restaurants can just decide keep going, and they basically right now can do nothing with this. So it's like a complicated situation for them. And of course, some companies, they define all demands for exit or reduction of activities and just keep all their activity as usual. Some companies are also claim humanitarian commitments, as some tech companies which say, well, we can just cut Russia from global network, things like this.
So I just wanted to also just take a moment and right now, Tanya's done a really good job of explaining the geopolitical situation, the sanctions in general, and what exactly is happening against Russia, what's happening in Ukraine, of course. And so this is all very important. But what we want to talk about now is what does this mean for us in the KYC world? What does it mean for our research? How does it impact it? Because it does impact it significantly. So it's important for us to kind of in a way shift gears and think about it in that context of this framework. In order to do that, I know many of you are familiar with this, but I want to talk a little bit about what we do at Sqope and why this matters for us. So we have objectives in our due diligence and our KYC research, and especially when it comes to individuals from Russia and the CIS. So some of it includes, of course, identifying sanctions exposure, and it's not so simple. It's not so simple as using a tech solution, and Tanya will talk about that in a moment as well. These don't suffice, and so a lot of times we need to look through complex networks and complex connections between different people. We also identify additional risks, of course, just some of them, including political exposure, criminal exposure, and money laundering risks, and reputational matters as well. For our clients, it's very important. Of course, there's many others, including business ethics and sector risk and things like this. But these are some of the key elements. Also, we look to understand the source of wealth of the target of our investigation. So if we're looking up an individual for one of our clients, they really want to understand where does this person's money come from. So I just wanted to bring it back to the point about why does this impact us? Of course, it impacts the whole world. It impacts Russia and various citizens and ultra high net worth individuals, but it impacts our work and what we do. And I'll let Tanya explain how that happens.
Okay, so just, saying from my personal perspective as an analyst, as an editor, the research for Russian-speaking subject is going to change forever. We can't keep doing research like it has been before, and we'll talk actually why it changes. So the first very big issue is the war situation in Ukraine changes very quickly and every day. I can start the report on subject today, and he will be without sanction exposure. And in 2 days, he will be sanctioned by several nations. So you can't just, assume that the situation is static. You need to monitor it basically every day. And there is a need of constant monitor of the sanctions announcement and nuanced understanding of different types of sanctions, because we didn't go into this, but there are so many nuances in different countries and different sanctions with different meanings. So in order to provide the proper context, you need to be very, very concentrated on the task. And in addition to official announcements by different governments, there is huge media coverage of the conflict, and investigative journalists and analysts and academics, they all publish investigations about Russia and wealth and opinion pieces about sanctions and possible future developments. And you need to understand everything very clearly. What are news, what are facts, what are opinions, what is relevant to everything. And the media coverage of the conflict can be highly subjective. Different countries and different organizations, they all have their own agendas, and fake news to establish certain narratives and paid PR campaigns and so on. And it just much more information than usual, with everything you need to be able to to control. And future sanction vectors are heavily dependent on Russia's decisions on the battlefield. Will there be escalation tomorrow, or peace agreements, or like very dramatic change in Russia's governments? And we just don't know what will happen. And so there's like this understanding what happens today, it's only relevant for today. It's maybe will not be around for tomorrow. So it's a much more complicated situation than it was before. And one of KYC research is very dependent on commercial databases, which provide corporate information about companies in different jurisdictions. And due all the sanctions and all the developments in Russia, most of these companies now working, or if they're not working right now, they will be working very soon on their own solutions in order to identify connections to Russia and to Russian companies. And such solutions, you need to use them, and we need to use them very carefully, as they can provide only basic partial picture. Firstly, there's this huge problem of ownership via offshore jurisdictions, which some countries, they just don't provide ownership information at all. And we depended on leaks, we depended on private investigations, and this information will not be available in these commercial solutions. And there's always a question of how current the presence and connections, because maybe they were relevant, at the beginning of the war, but they're not relevant anymore because a lot of things changing every day. So we always need to question ourselves, like where in time we put these connections. And these connections will be very straightforward connections, ownership connections, maybe some executives, stuff like this, and it will not provide more nuanced connections which are not documented on, in contracts and on paper. And this solution also, they mostly provide picture of past connections, but it will be very hard, if not impossible, to flag future hidden connections through these solutions. So although everyone will use them, we really need to be careful with how we interpret this data, and always be aware this is not the full picture. If we don't see any connections with these databases, it basically means nothing. Maybe there are different connections that are just not on paper. And it connects to media situation in Russia, as our KYC research is based on open sources, and it's very dependent on strong local independent media, which provides journalistic investigations about Russian businessmen and the situation in Russia. And in Russia, there were actually several very good, credible journalistic projects, which all already shut down their activity completely, or will have very big hardships continuing their activity inside Russia. And while Putin's regime always has been known for its propaganda and censorship efforts, since the start of the war in Ukraine, the situation has worsened dramatically. There's escalating media shutdowns imposed by Russian government, and or media companies themselves, or they actually blocked by the Russian media regulator. They're closing their activity in Russia because, in Russia, you can't even call a war a war. So it's very dangerous for journalists. You can go to jail for 15 years if you say the word war in connection to the Ukrainian invasion. And I'm sorry. And also the Russian government restricts access to Western social media platforms. everything owned by Meta, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. It's much harder to a journalist to be active inside Russia. You have to use VPN for everything. And numerous Russian and foreign media organizations just suspended news operation within Russia, for example, BBC and stuff like this. They just say, well, it's not worth to be inside. Journalists leaving, even journalists who work in pro-Russian media organizations, they leave it because it's just too dangerous to be in Russia. So with this situation, we're losing a lot of very good relevant sources, and we need to find different ways how to acquire this information on what sources we can use in order to, understand all the relevant risks related to our subjects. And this dramatic change makes it necessary for us to adapt our research. And if past credible journalistic investigations were published on dedicated websites, like each group had their own news website, had their own blog, stuff like this. Now the findings move to new platforms and to social media and messaging services. And here comes into play our as a team years of experience with Russian media sources, because you need to know who to follow. You need which journalists are credible. Understanding the credibility of news sources will be much harder, as they will not be part of an established project. In addition, not all journalists will want to publish information under their real name. So you need to know from in which projects they worked. Are they credible? What is their history? And if you didn't know it before, it's much harder to understand who are all these people. And information from social media and messaging services, of course, at some point will be reposted as articles. And it makes it much harder to check and verify. And sometimes it's even impossible to find the original publication. Like what is the source, who is the journalist, who published this investigation. And such platforms, they are not intended for efficient archiving. Not all information is indexed by Google. It's hard to find all the info, and you need to constantly monitor sources in real time and to be aware of what happens, because in order to find relevant information, you need to know it exists, and you're like kind of in a loop. And we, as doing the KYC research, we were always aware of this platforms, and we were using in Telegram. It was very important. And to give you an example, after the Russian government went after Navalny and his team, which provided a lot of very good investigation inside Russia, they just started publishing this stuff on Twitter. So we will always have been aware of this, but now it's will be in future reports, it will be one of the main focuses where to find the information. And we will use different skills to read this information, different skills to verify this information. And and in the past, we often used official financial data about companies in order to understand the subject source of wealth and how this information can be. And now, with all the changes, this financial information is not relevant anymore. For example, we don't know yet how fast the sanctions will influence the Russian economy, including a possible collapse. So now a big company which had millions or billions of rubles in revenue, it means nothing about its actual current situation. It says nothing about its worth. And in Ukraine, the situation is even more complicated, because right now the Russian army is actively destroying civilian infrastructures. So we don't know yet, and we will possibly will not know for years how it will actually influence the companies. Will all the assets will be destroyed? And there are a lot of big companies in Ukraine, and both in Russia and Ukraine, possibly there will be no updated financial information for several years, with all the war and problems and everything. So we basically losing a very big source. And also companies which are heavily dependent on the Russian and Ukrainian markets, or companies which are dependent on supply chains from these countries, They also will be influenced. We will, and we will see these changes only in a year when it will be next year financial reports. So for this company, it's very important to understand how they depended on Russia or Ukraine, because right now very high revenues possibly say nothing about the companies. They possibly say nothing about someone's source of wealth because the situation changed. And also in Russia, we expect a very significant number of previously private companies to become at least partially owned by the government. So it's very relevant to understanding political exposure. It will, of course, influence risk assessment, both of the individuals directly connected to the client, but also business partners abroad, if there's still business partners abroad or clients. And it happens in several different ways. Firstly, dozens of Western companies received letters by Russian government saying, if you are leaving the country, we'll take in all your assets. And also there's some suggestions for laws. So if the companies own more than 25% of individuals from unfriendly states, countries which sanction Russia, the assets also will be taken. These companies will be nationalized, will be owned by the Russian government. And in different way, lots of Western companies are selling their shares or bonding their shares, in big Russian companies, in big energy Russian companies, and the Russian government now gets these shares basically for free, for nothing. And these previously very big private companies will now be owned by the government. And even if there will be change in, Putin will be defeated, this company still will be for a while owned by the government. And another point which you'll need to remember, China is very interested to buy Russian companies, especially big companies, which, their shares now are very low priced. So they consider buying or increasing their stakes in Russian energy sector. So we will see much more Chinese governmental influence in Russia from now. And it will, influence the market and risks for years. And one of more significant challenges for the KYC research in the future will be nuanced understanding of sanctions exposure. As more and more Russian richest people are being sanctioned, they will want to try to sell their assets abroad and to hide their connections to these assets. And now what happens is only the beginning. Basically, United States in its arrest launched a so-called oligarch task force in order to increase cooperation as part of the anti-Russian sanctions effort. Each member country of the task force will collect and share information to take concrete action against Russian oligarchs, including sanctions, asset freezing, and civil and criminal asset seizure, and also criminal prosecution. Also, United States announced it will investigate and prosecute people, banks, and additional establishment, which will help rich Russians hide or launder their luxury assets and money. So this makes the sanction exposure very, very important, because people who were connected in the past to sanctioned individuals are in much more danger than before. I can give you two examples which happens now. One case in United States, a former Fox News executive allegedly violated US sanctions by helping a Russian businessman to launch a television network. So he is investigated right now. He is not even a direct business partner, but he's still under investigation because of his connection to a sanctioned individual. And another example, last weekend, Germany stopped a Russian oligarch from transferring his shares to his wife's offshore. So he wanted his company in Germany not to be sanctioned, and the government just stopped it. Like, he didn't allow him to transfer his shares, which was possible in the past. Another question of sanction exposure, if like not the whole world is sanctioning Russia right now, there's a lot of countries which still interested to to make business connections as usual with Russia, China, India, Middle East, no sanctions. So there's a question if United States will impose secondary sanctions on countries which will keep their business relations with Russia, which secondary sanctions basically sanctioning the countries which don't sanction Russia. So this makes the question of sanctions exposure much harder and nuanced, and we assess that as the situation will develop, Western governments will establish more sophisticated ways to find frontmen who will hold sanction oligarchs' assets on their behalf. And ideally, with our research, we want to identify these potential individuals and highlight possible risks. It's not enough anymore to look into immediate circles connected to the oligarchs. If we look into like circles of connection, if you're under direct sanctions, very black and white, you're under sanctions. If you're looking like to immediate connections, direct business partners, 50% rule, which says, if a company is owned more 50% or more by a sanctioned individual, it's also sanctioned by the United States. Family members, which all these thousands of new sanctions include oligarchs' family members. It's not enough to look into only these people, because people who are much further away from the sanctioned individual have much higher risk right now, as we have seen with this Fox News executive, business partners outside of Russia, clients, current and former employees, family, kids of family friends, and so on and so on. All these people who usually will say, well, they're too far away from the sanctioned individual, now they are much higher risks than before. And and people who are not yet sanctioned but are afraid they will be sanctioned in the future, or there are like high chances they will be sanctioned, they're now looking into ways into more smarter ways how to hide their assets. So we need the out of the box approach in order to identify these possible connections, to identify these people who can hold these assets for them. It will not be, the immediate, not their daughter, not their business partner, not the immediate connection. And it's like very dependent on each subject and very dependent on their history. I know like in the past, a lot of very rich people used their very close former employees, which suddenly you see someone drops all their shares, and all their shares goes to someone who was also director in his company. Stuff like this.
I just want to add to this. So, firstly, Tanya, it's a really good point. What's interesting and what I really want to highlight here is that this has always been an issue with Russia or any country with a lot of sanctioned individuals and companies. For us, it's been a key part of what we did up till now, as Russia has always been a very heavily sanctioned country. As Tanya showed in one of the earlier slides, the amount of sanctioned individuals, the amount of sanctions against Russia over more than doubled in the course of the past month. So it just this has always affected us, but now the extent is way greater. It's basically even our clients are currently approaching us over individuals who are not really ultra high net worth individuals, and kind of just more successful Russians and not Russians, also Belarusians, Ukrainians, and people like that, who we have to really look in depth to understand their potential connections to people who might even be otherwise connected to a sanctioned individual. So it's basically, as Tanya displaying here, there's so many layers to this and so many possibilities of connections to someone who's under sanctions, and potential that they're just acting as frontmen for them, that it makes our job much more complicated. And as Tanya alluded to earlier, of course, we're only able to do this because we've already had the decade of experience, or over a decade of experience in doing this already for certain subjects. We're just doing it for a lot more targets than before. So it's a really interesting situation. It's a very complex one. and definitely requires getting a grasp of it at this point.
Okay. So basically, right now, because the situation is so new and basically never happened before, there are a lot of things which, we don't know, and no one knows what will happen next, how sanctions will influence business partners and clients of sanctioned individuals, both for Western countries, but also for Asia and Middle East, and countries who don't want to sanction Russia yet. Like, what will United States do? Will be secondary sanctions? We don't know. Which sectors are the riskiest? Like, there's a difference between medical sector and energy sector or arms sector, like very different situations. And what will happen to the sanctioned individuals' frozen assets and how fast? Because now all the governments they take the yachts and the real estates and everything, but like it's not so simple just to take it. They need a legal process. They need to decide what to do with all these assets, with all this money. And it's very nice when the articles say, well, we'll donate the money to Ukrainian refugees, but like in real life, it's not so simple. And what will happen to influential Russians? A lot of Russians have several passports. Will they try to denounce their Russian passport to lower their risk? Will actually not having a Russian passport right now, but having in the past, how it affects someone's risk? Will Russian businessmen try to start from zero in new countries in Middle East, in Asia? How it will influence these local markets? Will it corrupt? Like some countries, even like giving example of Israel, a lot of Jewish, very rich Russians are coming here right now. If they decide to start doing their business here, will they corrupt this really small local market? It's an open question. And of course, there's also a question, not only businessmen living in Russia, journalists and entertainments and singers, very rich people who, of course, have money abroad. They leave Russia right now. Some of these people were actually connected to the Russian government. They actually were, supported Putin, and now they say, well, war is our red line. We are leaving. Like, what it says about the risk, like the previous connection, as you know, like as a very big entertainment man in Russia. We don't know yet, and we will have to see what happens.
Great.
Yeah, this is my part.
Awesome. So I already have a few questions for some people, but I'll give everyone a chance. If you have any more, if anyone else wants to ask some questions, you can either write to me directly in the chat or write to me in the Q&A section of Zoom. So I'll let everyone have a chance to do that. But in the meantime, I have one question for Tanya. How do you keep up with the changing availability of media? I think they're referring to basically what you mentioned earlier, that there's so much more restrictions on the media in Russia and people going kind of underground or into Telegram. How do you follow it? It seems it's obviously a lot more difficult right now. But
basically, right now the situation is very difficult in Russia. But I believe these journalists who are living in Russia or in hiding, they will try to join like some future projects. Like even now, Navalny's team, they launching like an international project. I think lots of those people who was in the past in Russia will try to join Western projects in order to continue their research. And of course, there will be much more in Western countries. There's much more interest in Russia right now. So probably more journalists will try, not Russian journalists, Western journalists will try to, to have more in-depth investigations about Russia, which is, of course, great for us.
Very good. Thank you, Tanya. And there's another question that also refers to the media, and basically asking for the risk of bias. Like, is there risk of too much bias against Russia from the journalists, and as many might be in the opposition?
Well, Western journalists, were always against Russia even before the war, and usually, it's like credible organization. We trust them to do research, even, like putting aside like political opinions. They're more dangerous when, like as I told, fake news, and with Russia will try to pretend to be some Western media source and like put in their agenda. I think there's more danger in that than in Western journalists being biased.
Very good point. And also, I guess it's important to add that, at least for us, there's a couple of things that we do a very heavy triangulation of anything we find, just to cross-reference and make sure it's true. And also, I think some of you, it looks like, attended my past webinars about how we conduct KYC online. And basically, a big part of that, a big part of what I discussed there is about how to evaluate a source for its own credibility. So that's something that you have to do, and that's something that we have to do. Naturally, a lot of sources that we're familiar with are continue to exist in different platforms, different forums, but it doesn't change the fact that anytime you find a new source, you have to do your due diligence effectively on the source itself. And looks like we have one last question for now. Do you see the pace of sanctions slowing down at this point, or is it continuing at the same pace that it's been over the past several weeks?
Well, I don't think it can be as fast as it have been, because it was really unprecedented, like thousands of sanctions, hundreds of sanctions every day. And in the end, like everything which could have been done immediately have been done already. And, now these countries will have to consider much higher risk sanctions, like on energy industry, which will be very high price to the whole world, so they can't so easily sanction the things. So unless there will be like some very huge escalation in Ukraine right now, I think it can't be this fast for a long time. But something can happen and the situation can completely change, and we just don't know for sure anything.
Very good point on that. At this point, I don't see any more questions. I'll give everyone some time if you have any more. In the meantime, as I promised, if you guys have any questions, any further questions about what Tanya spoke about, and anything comes to your mind later, or if you want to know more about Sqope and our services and how we address these sorts of issues, you can contact either myself or Roy Lavi. He's the managing director of Continental Europe and is based in Geneva, Switzerland. I'm of course here in Tel Aviv. You have our contact details. Again, you'll receive this the whole presentation in PDF form shortly, as well as a recording on our website. So you'll have our contact details here. You can reach out to us at any point. I still see no further questions at this time. So with that, firstly, I want to thank you, Tanya, so much for this. It was super enlightening, and I really appreciate everything you shared. And I want to thank all of our attendees for joining and for taking part in this. It's always our pleasure to share our insights on ongoing developments and anything that has to do with KYC and AML. So I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time, and wish you all a nice rest of your day.
Thank you for attending.
Bye.